Good morning, everybody. It's just David here with my weekly message for you. Many as you might have known, um, when I went to university, first of all, my undergraduate degree was in mathematics, and I had, or at least it worked out quite well. I had rather noble reasons for studying mathematics, um, and I'm afraid none of them to do with great ability, as my sort of final results showed, nor indeed an overwhelming enthusiasm for the subject. There were other concerns, really. It struck me that most subjects in the sort of scientific world in, required you to be in a laboratory, generally in the afternoons of an undergraduate degree. And I didn't particularly like sort of laboratory work. I didn't really like the idea of working in the afternoons. So you might have said, well, why don't you do an art subject? Well, I might have done a humanity or an art subjects, but they required you to read quite a lot of books. And now I enjoy reading, but there's always something about being sort of forced to read a book because it's coursework, as it were. And of course, although you don't have to go into a lab to do them doing anyway, they do sort of take up quite a lot of time. Good thing about mathematics is that you have lectures and you have what's it called, seminars. They don't really take that much time, and we're talking about sort of 6 or 7 hours a week. And I tried to avoid Fridays or afternoons. That was really beyond the pale. And you didn't have to read any big books. In fact, the idea in mathematics is to write as little as possible. A solution to a problem is neater if it's shorter. That's one of the rules. More elegant, we would say. And also, you didn't have to ever go into a laboratory because you weren't concerned with doing sort of the more practical or technical aspects of things. And yes, so basically that meant I had a lot more time to go down the pub. And I'd like to say I joined in lots of other sort of cultural activities, all the opportunities that the social and artistic endeavour that university gives you. And I think some of that was true, but lots of it ended up in the pub. So there we are. Why do I say this? Well, there is one thing I noticed during this time was, I did have to do some. The idea was actually spent quite a lot of time working on problems on your own. You work through sort of problem sheets, and what I found was that I would sort of have a look at these problem sheets. You might have a sort of problem sheet each week for each different module you were doing, and I'd look at these things and think it'd be really great if I could tackle 2 or 3 of these, and that will kind of then give me a bit more sort of spare time. But what I noticed was that if I sat down and did them, having been lectured on them, I really couldn't get anywhere. I would just stare at the paper, you'd fiddle around with equations and stuff, wouldn't really get you anywhere. But then actually, if I did sort of come back to them 2 or 3 days later, not having consciously at any point sort of looked at them, suddenly I would sit down and say, oh, well, yes, it's obvious how you do that problem. And I'd make quite a lot of progress through the problem sheet. And it's very much the same for me with sermons. People often say to me, how long does it take to write a sermon? Well, the answer is it comes in various stages. There's a bit of reading, which just depends how much you kind of get interest or what fires you up, but a bit of background reading, maybe an hour or two or something. But then the writing it is actually quite short. And you might say, well, it sounds like it. But actually, for me anyway, my technique is to write it as though I'm speaking it. So I don't think you want a carefully edited essay. I think you want to actually write quite fast and sort of almost talk it to yourself as you're doing it, so you get that kind of, here is a performance rather than I'm reading out my latest essay. I don't know if I'm successful in that or not. But again, the other thing I notice is that if you've done the reading and the research beforehand, and you then say allow a week or so, and then you sit down, generally you've got plenty of ideas, and it just goes. The trouble is, if you don't, then you sit there and you just stare at a blank page. Now, you might think, why am I talking about all this? Why am I rambling on? And the reason is that um, I want today to talk about sort of subconscious processes. And what sort of made me think about this was that somebody was kind enough to say at the APCM that they kind of quite enjoyed these talks. You might now be revising your opinion as I sort of wander on. But the point is, I thought actually, these messages are no problem. As you can see, they don't involve a huge amount of preparation. And perhaps the reason I'm sort of slightly, don't want to sort of push them too far is that I generally just chat, as you can see, about what's on my mind. They're not great, they're not honed or scripted or anything else. They're about things that are churning on inside. So all of those three things, sort of these talks, sermon preparation, solving mathematical problems, the thing they all have in common, and I just want to think about for today, is the idea of subconscious processes. In other words, you're not actually thinking about the thing. You're not thinking about the mathematical problem or the sermon or the talk, but you've kind of alerted yourself you've got to do it. You may have taken a preliminary look at what's involved. Then you've not consciously thought about it at all. And yet when you come back a few hours later, a few days, even a few weeks later, somehow you've processed it and it's much easier to deliver the final result. Now, for me, those are three good examples of that, but for others, it will be different things in your life. But I think we all have that experience, don't we? We're kind of taking an initial look at something, then kind of not consciously looking at it and thinking, oh, it's probably a bit too hard, then coming back to it, and then suddenly find it much easier. And you think kind of what has gone on in between. And I think what has gone on in between is that your subconscious has been kind of mulling over it without you knowing it. Now, I know that sounds very obvious. We take this slightly for granted. Now, the idea of subconscious, of course, rises with the modern discipline of psychoanalytics. So you think of Freud as the great person, and then Jung, and then a whole kind of industry has followed. But of course, those are quite recent developments, I suppose. And I suppose there are signs of that kind of understanding beforehand, particularly actually in Christian spirituality. But I suppose, Freud is the first one to set it out in a kind of clinical way. The idea that there is this thing called the subconscious that kind of is peddling away, doing the work when we're not conscious of it a bit, and that you might use the image of the iceberg or the swan gliding along with the lots of paddling underneath that you can't see. As I say, we now take this for granted. It enters everyday life. We talk about subconsciously thinking something or subconsciously considering something. But of course, for a lot of history, people have not really thought in those terms or realized what that's going on. As I say, there are signs of it, and one of the signs of it, I think, is in Christian spirituality. And I think what follows from this is the fact that if we are to be involved, God is to be involved in our lives and our whole selves, and I think this is the kind of message, then God has to be at work in us subconsciously as well as consciously. So, I may well think that, there are specific times when perhaps I pray, or I'm in worship, or I'm doing a particular sort of bit of pastoral work. And those bits are where I'm, my conscious focus is on that. But I suppose it's that thing that underneath, even when I'm making supper or taking the dog for a walk or filling in a tax return, God is still working, hopefully somehow on my subconscious. And I think particularly we need to, I think there are a couple of things. We need to allow God time and space to do that. So sometimes there will be things that might be a situation that we've prayed about or thought about, And actually, we pray about it a week later and we've come to slightly different conclusions about it, because I think perhaps God has been working there. And also, I think it's that idea also of its importance in Christian spirituality and Christian life is the idea of habits, which I've talked about before. But I suppose, and the point is, and this is sort of very fashionable in ethics, is that virtue consists in being in good habits of behaviour, as it were. So to be virtuous, to behave virtuously, is somebody who habitually, almost automatically behaves virtually, rather than somebody who has to say, right, now I must consciously try and act virtuously. If your natural thing is to almost reach in your pocket and give some money to charity without thinking about something, that's a kind of habitual response. And the thing about habits is that they are very often formed unconsciously. We do things lots and lots of times, and we kind of get a sort of muscle memory or a psychological memory. And so when we come to it again, we just also do it automatically. A bit like driving a car. When you're first driving a car, you're very conscious of every control and button, etc. Now, if somebody says to me, how many times did you change gear, or what gear are you in? You think, well, I'm not quite sure. I know it's right. So I do think that, yes, God works through us consciously, and it's important to give time to that. But also, God will work through us unconsciously. And perhaps sometimes just to recognize that, as I say, perhaps sometimes when we come back to something that we've sort of consciously thought about or prayed about, but then come back to it, and somehow it shifted in the week or the 2 or 3 weeks since we last considered it. So again, as I say, the danger of these messages is that they are just slightly sort of unconscious ramblings, but my defense of that is that actually subconscious ramblings are quite important, and actually sometimes realizing, if you can't realize actually what your subconscious is, because obviously you can't because it's subconscious, but actually just sometimes realizing the fruits of it, that actually coming a week or 2 or a month or a year later and saying, hey, God's put me in a slightly different situation that I was last month, last year. And just acknowledging that God is working in our whole selves. And that includes our actions, our conscious prayer life. But he's working deep down with us as well, subconsciously as well. And for that, God be praised. Thank you.